I want to use this lecture to talk about the other two constituent groups of progressives, settlement house workers and socialists. Established by middle-class reformers, settlement houses were intended to help the largely immigrant poor cope with the harsh conditions of urban life. Much of the early inspiration for them came from young, college-educated Protestant women. That's a new class, by the way, college-educated women, from comfortable but not particularly wealthy backgrounds. Some were inspired by parents and grandparents who had fought slavery as abolitionists. They were highly educated, talented, and sensitive to social injustice. They were not content, therefore, to be solely wife and mother. Established in 1889 in Chicago by Jane Addams and Helen Gates Starr, was the first great settlement house in America, Hull House. The year before, these women had visited London's Toynbee Hall, where a small group of middle-class men had been working with the city's poor since 1884. Addams and Starr came back to Chicago and bought a decaying mansion that once belonged to a guy named Charles J. Hull. By 1889, Hull House stood among factories, churches, saloons, and tenements inhabited by foreign-born working-class families. Jane Addams emerged as the leader and guiding force of Hull House. She moved into the building and required the same of all the workers there, some of the most notable examples of which were Florence Kelley, Alice Hamilton, Julia Lathrop. Notice that this is a female-driven movement in America. What did they do? Well, they set up a nursery for children of working mothers. They set up a penny savings bank, an employment bureau, a baby clinic, a neighborhood playground, and social clubs. Determined to minister to cultural as well as economic needs, Hull House sponsored an orchestra, reading groups, and a lecture series. Chicago's growing circle of reform-minded intellectuals, artists, and politicians contributed their services. John Dewey taught philosophy at Hull House. Frank Lloyd Wright lectured on architecture. It's pretty cool, a nonprofit who has free lectures on architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright. Clarence Darrow spent a lot of time there. He was the most famous attorney in America, and he represented unions. He was known as the working men's lawyer, Clarence Darrow. In 1893, Illinois Governor John P. Altgeld named Florence Kelley the state's chief factory inspector. Her inspections led to Illinois' first factory law, which prohibited child labor, limited women to 8 hours a day, and authorized the state to hire enforcement inspectors. Altgeld himself was a progressive. You'll recall he was the governor who refused to use state militia to stop the Pullman strike. Julia Lathrop used her appointment to the State Board of Charities to campaign for improvements in the care of the poor, the handicapped, the delinquent. She also established the Department of Social Research at the University of Chicago. It became the first school of social work. She basically invented, she and all these other women invented the field of social work. Alice Hamilton overcame gender discrimination to become a doctor and kind of created the field of public health. She was the first female faculty at Harvard. Although not as famous as the muckrakers, Hull House leaders were steadily drawn into the public arena. Inspired by Hull House, thousands of women nationwide opened more than 400 settlement houses. By 1910, Jane Addams was one of the nation's most famous women. She and other settlement house workers played a key role in designing the progressive agenda. Now, the way I'm describing these settlement house workers, they sound like liberal do-gooders. And they were do-gooders, and they were passionate about what they were doing, but they were not liberal in the sense we mean today. In fact, they were quite conservative culturally, and their attempts to help the poor were very paternalistic and had unintended consequences. Jane Addams, however, although she disapproved of machine politics, she saw the benefits they delivered to their constituents. Although she wanted immigrants to become Americans, she appreciated their immigrant gifts, she called them, and thought that part of their identity should be preserved. But she was unusual in this respect. Most reformers saw immigrants as culturally and even racially inferior. Jane Addams was troubled, however, by new working-class entertainments, which gave adolescents unregulated opportunities for intimate association, and the emergence of something called the New Woman. She tended to equate female sexuality with prostitution and sought to suppress both. Reformers had passion to get rid of prostitution. Adams saw the serious problem in urban life among immigrant and rural women who were lured to prostitution or preferred it to 65 poorly paid hours a week in a sweatshop. But reformers' zeal on this subject exaggerated the problem and led to questionable legislation, such as the Mann Act in 1910, which criminalized the transportation of women across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes, unquote. Black boxer Jack Johnson fell victim to the law when he and his white secretary moved across state lines. He obviously wasn't selling her into prostitution. It did not matter. They would eventually marry. He was prosecuted under this Mann Act. Unintended consequences. Another social ill, a vice addressed by these people, was drinking. Their cultural conservatism was especially apparent in their attitudes towards alcohol. Drinking rivaled prostitution as a problem in poor working class areas. Men wasted money in saloons, souring domestic relations. Reformers preached to workers to refrain from drinking and sought laws to close down saloons. The Progressives joined forces with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was almost 300,000 women by 1911, and the Anti-Saloon League. By 1916, their collective efforts won prohibition of the sale and manufacture of alcohol in 16 states. In 1919, their crowning achievement was the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the sale and manufacture of alcohol nationwide. Reformers failed to see or ignored, however, the social role of saloons in ethnic working class communities. On Chicago's South Side, for example, saloons provided tens of thousands of workers with the only decent spot for lunch. There were no cafeterias, and no one wanted to eat a lunch in a slaughterhouse. They served traditional food and drinks from immigrant cultures. They provided meeting space for fraternal societies and offered camaraderie in native languages. They also served as informal bankers, cashing checks and making small loans. Alcohol was also central to certain ethnic ways of life. For example, Catholic communion, the Jewish high holy days. Wine and beer marked the celebration of births, marriages, deaths, etc. So this created a gulf between the reformers and the immigrants they were trying to, quote unquote, help. Let's talk about socialism. Issues like female sexuality and alcohol drew progressives in a conservative direction, but other issues drew them towards socialism. In the early 20th century, socialism meant transferring ownership of industries from industrialists to the laboring masses. This is known as nationalization. Important word we're going to use a lot more in this course. Socialists felt this would make it impossible for wealthy elites to control society. Socialist Party of America was founded in 1901. It became a political force in the first 16 years of the century and influenced progressivism. In 1912, at the peak of its influence, it enrolled more than 115,000 members, and its presidential candidate, none other than Eugene V. Debs, got almost 1 million votes, 6% of the 1912 vote. That's a huge third-party win. And in that same year, 1,200 socialists held office in 340 municipalities. Of these, 79 were mayors. The mayor of Berkeley, California, not surprisingly, was a socialist. Many periodicals spread socialism. The most important was called Appeal to Reason. It was sent weekly to 750,000 subscribers by a Kansan named Julius Wayland. See the headline here, Rockefeller's gunmen murder women and children in Colorado. In 1905, Appeal to Reason published The Jungle in serial form. It was so successful, it forced the federal government to regulate the meatpacking industry. Socialists came in many varieties. German working-class immigrants in Milwaukee, East European Jewish immigrants in New York City, former populist farmers in the Southwest, especially in Oklahoma. Oklahoma was decidedly socialist. In 1912, Debs got 16% of the vote in Oklahoma. It's funny because Oklahoma today is the most conservative state politically. It was Barack Obama's worst state in 2008. In the West, socialism was popular among workers in isolated areas where industrialists wielded enormous power, for example, miners, timber cutters. These radical workers joined the militant union, the Industrial Workers of the World, which from 1905 to 1913 was allied with the Socialist Party. Socialists varied not only by ethnicity and occupation, but also in their politics. The radical IWW often called for revolution, while mainstream socialism as articulated by Debs, was much more respectful of American traditions. These mainstream socialists, interestingly, saw themselves as saviors of the American Republic, the heirs of Jefferson. Their belief in American democracy was evident in their support for Debs as president through the conventional political system. Like other progressives, Protestant religious beliefs lay beneath their quest for social justice, a cooperative commonwealth. These differences between mainstream and radical socialists would fragment their movement after 1912, but for a decade or so, they coexisted thanks largely to the eloquence and leadership of Debs. Released from jail in 1895 for his role in the Pullman strike, Debs made a rousing speech to 100,000 people in which he glorified the Declaration of Independence. Debs' speeches both attracted and disturbed progressives. He spoke eloquently about the dangers of unregulated capitalism and concentrated wealth, and believed a strong state was the answer. Progressives often worked with socialists to win economic and political reforms at the municipal and state levels, and many people moved easily back and forth between socialism and progressivism. People who did so included Florence Kelley, Clarence Darrow, Walter Lippmann, a man who had become a close advisor to Woodrow Wilson during World War I, John Dewey, and Helen Keller. Helen Keller was a progressive activist and an ardent socialist, and probably the only socialist in Alabama who has a statue to her. On the other hand, Debs' talk of revolution scared progressives. So did his efforts to organize a working-class political movement independent of middle-class involvement or control. Progressives did not want to end capitalism. They wanted to tame it. They wanted to improve the lives of the working masses, but they did not want to give them control of the country. The progressives therefore hoped to offer a program with enough socialist elements to neutralize Debs' more radical ideas. And this worked.